the world's writers will walk through those gates. And if you hang around, you get a chance to talk to them.
I'm interested in conversations that deal with things that matter, but real, how do we live our lives?
First of all, make climate change personal in your life. The second step is get angry and get active. And the third step, and believe it or not, I think this is the most important, we have to imagine this world that we want to hurry towards.
It's about kindness is looking at people as people and not as I voted this, I do this, whatever it is. There are some people we will never get along with, but most of us are a complex mass of different things.
Hello, I'm Ian Rankin. I've been with the Edinburgh International Book Festival basically since day one. I went as a student, as a reader, as a fan of writing. Later on, I was invited to go as an author, which was a thrill. And it's a spectacular experience. It's a meeting of minds. It's a way to open your mind to new experiences, to new ideas, nuanced debate, entertainment, something for every age group. And that's what keeps me going back year after year after year. Long may it continue.
Good evening and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival, wherever you are in the world. I'm Damian Barr and I'm your host for this evening's event. Thank you for joining me in conversation with the glorious Garth Greenwell as we explore intimate truths. This evening is part of the groundbreaking Voices in Literature series and is supported by the British Council. This year's entire festival programme is entirely free of charge, and this is only possible thanks to the generosity of supporters and donors. That's you. If you enjoy this evening, and I trust that you will, I hope you'll consider making a donation so the book festival team can continue their great work. Your support really does make all the difference. While you're all still arriving, a few words on how this evening's going to work. In a moment, Garth will pour treacle in your ears, then we'll talk for a bit, and at 9:15 we'll take as many of your questions as we can. Garth Greenwell arrived on the literary scene as a ready-made star with his debut, What Belongs to You. As you'll hear in a moment, he reads his prose as beautifully as he writes it. Reading a book where every character is alert to and even wary of touch definitely feels like a breach of social distancing. His next book, Cleanness, places its arms around the shoulders of his handsome debut and confronts many of the same themes and concerns, but is very much its own thing. Like his first book, Cleanness features an unnamed American teacher working in Sofia, Bulgaria, who falls for various men with whom he experiences pleasure and pain, and a certain amount of pleasure in pain. It's a New York Times bestseller, an instant classic, and a very helpful manual for anyone interested in nipple play or semicolons. Please welcome, all the way from Iowa, Garth Greenwell. Garth!
Hi, Damien.
It's so good to see you.
It's wonderful to see you.
What time is it with you?
It's 2:30 in the afternoon here.
Okay, so you're feeling fresh. It's cocktail o'clock here. I'm not gonna lie. Cheers.
It's a pandemic, Damien. Every hour is cocktail hour.
And I am drinking a quarantini.
Your invention, isn't that right?
Exactly. Well, I think several people invented it at the same time, but my particular recipe has definitely got curative effects. Before we chat, I love hearing you read, and it would be a real privilege for everybody watching if you'd give us a wee reading from the book.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm going to read just a single paragraph from the book's second chapter. So the book, as Damian said, it's about an American high school teacher living and working in Sofia, Bulgaria, who is the same narrator as the narrator of my first book, What Belongs to You. In this second chapter, the chapter is titled Gospodar. Gospodar is the Bulgarian word that means master or lord. And in this scene, he is meeting for the first time a man he's chatted with online. And they're having a sexual encounter that is a sadomasochistic encounter that begins consensually and very slowly becomes something else. This is still from the beginning. You only need to know one word of Bulgarian, which is the word kuchko, which is an exact equivalent for the English word bitch. And this is the name that this man gives the narrator. He let go of my hair then, freeing his hand to move down the side of my face, almost stroking it before he cupped it in his palm. It was a tender gesture, and his voice was tender too as he said, kuchko, addressing me as if solicitously and tilting my head so that we gazed at each other face to face, his fingers flexed against my cheek almost in a caress. I leaned my head into him, resting it on his palm as he spoke again in that tone of tenderness or solicitude. Tell me, Kuchko, tell me what you want. And I did tell him, at first slowly and with the usual words, reciting the script that both does and does not express my desires. And then I spoke more quickly and more searchingly, drawn forward by the tone of his voice, what seemed like tenderness, although it was not tenderness, until I found myself suddenly in some recess or depth where I had never been. There were things I could say in his language because I spoke it poorly, without self-consciousness or shame, as if there were something in me unreachable in my own language, something I could reach only with that blunter instrument by which I too was made a blunter instrument. And I found myself at last at the end of my strange litany saying again and again, I want to be nothing, I want to be nothing. Good, the man said, good. Speaking with the same tenderness and smiling a little as he cupped my face in his palm and bent forward, bringing his own face to mine as if to kiss me, I thought, which surprised me, though I would have welcomed it. Good, he said a third time, his hand letting go of my cheek and taking hold of my hair again, forcing my neck farther back. And then suddenly and with great force, he spat into my face.
That's an incredible chapter. The entire book, you'll see my copy here has all these pages folded over where there are just sentences that I've spent so much time luxuriating in and undeniably being turned on by. It's one of the most erotic works of fiction I've ever read. It's an incredible book. You say there Gospodar means master. So our unnamed narrator is a teacher during the day. He's a sort of master in his own life in a way, but in his private life, he's very much not. And there's a great tension, isn't there, between his public self and private self.
Yeah, I think that's right. In fact, there's a kind of, or the narrator thinks about a resemblance between the word gospodar and the word gospodin, which is just the address for Mr. And it's what students call male teachers. They will call them gospodin. And, if I sort of had to summarize the deep subject of this book in a single word, it would be intimacy. And the idea that the book is interested in various kinds of intimacy. And, sex is one of those variants of intimacy that interests me. But I'm also interested in the intimacy of friendship. I'm interested in the intimacy between teachers and students. And then I'm interested in that weird public intimacy that is citizenship. The question of what does it mean to be intimate with a place?
Oh, that's fascinating. Those different levels of those questions, which do come up again and again in the novel. They meet one another. There are public protests where private feelings bubble up. There are tensions in the classroom between him and between other students, and then there's all the relationships where those tensions are also being negotiated. You've described the book as a leader cycle. I hope I'm saying that properly. In the context of singing, tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so, I grew up in a very kind of uncultural household. I grew up in Kentucky in the American South. I was the first generation of my family raised off the farm. My family were tobacco farmers. And so I came to art very late. And in high school, a choir teacher heard something in my voice and started giving me voice lessons and sort of launched me on a path to art through opera, through music. So music was my first education in the arts. And my first experience of how pieces can be made into wholes in art was through singing song cycles. And as I started to write this book, and especially to sort of, when I had, I think it was, 3 or 4 chapters, that was when I began thinking of it as a book and realizing that.
So until that point, it was just a collection of things.
Well, it wasn't a book at all. It was just, so I began writing the first chapters of what would become Cleanness while I was working on What Belongs to You. So, one of the first things I knew about What Belongs to You was that it needed to be a very streamlined container. That, that book, which is about an obsessive relationship, the book itself needed to be obsessively focused on that relationship. And so I knew there were just huge parts of the world I was writing about and of the narrator's experience that didn't fit into that book. And so, when I finished a big chunk of What Belongs to You, I would write a shorter scene of some other element of the life that was sort of calling to be written, but that I knew wouldn't fit into What Belongs to You. So I didn't think of it as a book at all. I just thought of it as writing scenes. It actually wasn't until I wrote Gospodar, which was the first fiction I wrote after finishing What Belongs to You, finishing the manuscript. The first fiction I wrote actually after coming back to the United States. I remember very well the sort of table in the cafe in Iowa City where I wrote most of that chapter. And writing that, which is about an S&M experience told from the perspective of the submissive, I immediately knew I needed to write a scene of an S&M experience sort of told from the perspective of the dominant. I wouldn't write that for years. It's the second to last chapter of the book, The Little Saint. But the fact that Gospodar called into existence this other chapter, this other scene, made the whole structure of the book come into existence. And I knew that it wasn't going to be a novelistic structure, that what I wanted were sort of chapters, each of which would be like a kind of node of intensity, and that the relationship between these nodes of intensity, that they wouldn't be connected by kind of chronology or by the cause and consequence of novelistic plot, that instead the relationship between them would have to do with things like key and motif and sort of these musical concepts, which are still the way that I think about structure, the first way I thought about structure. So it doesn't feel quite right to call it a story collection, although I'm happy for people to call it whatever they want. To me, it doesn't feel quite right to call it a story collection because of the intense relationship between the parts. It doesn't feel quite right to call it a novel. What it feels like to me is one of these song cycles that I began singing in high school.
Were there songs that didn't make it into the book in the same way that there was with What's Belonged to You, where you had that intense focus with your first book, and the second book, is more of a cycle? Are there songs that didn't make it that may crop up somewhere else?
Well, that's an interesting question. So there are not sort of chapters that were written that then sort of fell to the cutting room floor. I certainly had ideas. There were sort of other elements of the narrator's life that could have grown into chapters, but didn't.
Like what?
Well, I don't know that I know anymore. Certainly, as I take notes sort of over the years. There are a million ideas that then, it's interesting, when you have a glimmer of an idea, my experience is, some of those glimmers kind of accrue a kind of gravity about them and start attracting things and taking on density and substance, and other things don't. One of the things that was a curious feeling as I was finishing Cleanness, I finished it, I was, 4 or 5 years living in the United States. Again, I was going back to Bulgaria for 1 to 2 months every year while I was working on the book. But I did feel a sort of chapter of my own life and a chapter of my life as a writer kind of coming to a close, in the sense that, I knew when I finished What Belongs to You that I was not done writing about Sofia, this city that, is still the city I love most of any city in the world. Finishing Cleanness, and you mentioned the chapter of the book that's about a protest, and that was the last chapter I wrote. And, as part of this protest, the narrator walks around the city. And I remember as I was writing that chapter, feeling very much that it was kind of my farewell in prose to Sofia. So I don't anticipate writing more about Sofia. I know the next book I write will be about the American South.
So, and will that be the same character, the unnamed narrator, returning to the American South?
Well, it's an interesting question. Yes, I do think it will be the same narrator. And in some way, so I'm attracted to writers whose books, and, these are writers like Proust or W.G. Sebald, but also writers like Philip Roth or even someone like Alice Munro, writers whose books are sort of, each book is its own thing. It stands alone. It has a kind of, artistic, it's funny, a Bulgarian word is samostojatelstvo, a kind of an artistic coherence of its own. But then also the books overlap, or, my sense of the relationship between What Belongs to You and Cleanness is that the books intermingle. It's not that one's a sequel to the other, but they intermingle. And that, the idea that sort of each book is its own thing, but then also a kind of chapter in an ongoing project, is appealing to me. And the idea of books that are their own thing, but also kind of slide into other books, intermingle with other books. So in some ways, I think the next novel, which I shouldn't talk about that much because it's not written, but I think the next novel will be, in some ways, will intermingle with the middle section of What Belongs to You, which returns to the landscape of the narrator's childhood.
Okay. I'm now very excited about the next novel as well. Will there be as much sex in the next novel as there was in this novel? And although people think of What Belongs to You as having lots of sex in it, it actually doesn't have that much sex in it upon rereading. It's really interesting. I think people were just, critics were just so shocked to see any gay sex happening in a book that they suddenly just assumed the entire book was about it. But it is a preoccupation of yours in the sense of what it reveals, I think, about characters. You've said sex is a uniquely useful tool for a writer, no pun intended. And tell us what you mean by that, how you use sex in your writing, and what it means to you as a writer.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think sex is one of our densest forms of communication. And so I think it's, a remarkably useful tool for exploring relationships between characters. I think sex is an experience that is also hugely illuminative of the interior. I think in sex, we are very aware of our own experience, of our own consciousness. I think of sex as a kind of consciousness producing activity. It also seems to me that, sex is at once one of the moments, one of the experiences, maybe other than sickness, maybe the most powerful experience we have of our animal bodies. And yet it also seems to me that sex is the experience in which we have our clearest intimation of something in us that seems larger than the body. I think sort of all of our metaphysics comes from sex. And I think there's no accident in the fact that we have a single lexicon for both religious and erotic devotion. So sex gives us access to metaphysics. And then I also think sex is one of the places where we see most illuminated kind of the relationship between a biological given, a certain kind of drive, and then the specific particular historical and cultural forces that give shape and form to that drive. And so I think sex, as one sees, one of the greatest writers of sex in American literature is Toni Morrison. And, one of the things that one sees in a book like Beloved is how the erotic, how the sexual gives access to the largest questions of history and society. And, certainly queer theorists, queer thinkers, from Socrates to someone living today like Tim Dean, have had an understanding that the erotic is at the foundation of sociality itself, that the erotic desire, erotic expression is at the foundation of all ways that human beings interact with each other. And so it does seem to me like an extraordinary tool for the novelist. And I did want, in Cleanness, after having the experience of writing What Belongs to You, which, as you say, has, I think, maybe 2 pages of explicit sex writing, and yet from some of how people talk about it, you would think there was nothing in it but sex. I wanted
that says so much about the context into which that book was published, don't you think?
I think it probably says more about mainstream English language publishing in 2016 than it does about my book. Although I will say, I'm interested not just in the way that sex can be subject matter, but also in the way that sex can be style. And, I'm interested in the way that in a writer like Philip Roth, Philip Roth's stylistic breakthrough came because of sex. I'm interested in a writer like Emer McBride, who is inventing new technologies of novel writing, in large part through a kind of devotion to the erotic, to desire, to the sexual body. And so there's a way in which, I hope that my sentences, that there is something mimetic of the erotic in the sentences themselves, and that, maybe in that way it feels like the book is about sex, even when the subject matter is something entirely different.
Yeah, there's a sexual rhythm, a sexual cadence to it that is not about the subject, it's actually about the structure. You said in an interview, what excites me in writing sex isn't explicitness itself, but the combination of explicitness and a particular kind of sentence. And I think that's what you were just alluding to. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about those sentences and, your various dramas over the years with the semicolon.
So the semicolon, I think, is a very erotic piece of punctuation. I think that's true. Explicitness itself, in some sense, we live at a moment in a cultural context in which we have greater access to explicitness than any human being has ever had. We are absolutely just submerged in images of bodies and of sexualized bodies. And yet it seems to me that at the same time, there's a real dearth of representations of what I think of as embodiedness, which is a body filled with consciousness. I am very much a pro-pornography person, but it does seem to me sometimes that there is a kind of pornography that is prevalent today, maybe especially the kind of internet pornography that's engaged in a kind of arms race of extremity, where it seems like great lengths have been gone to expunge bodies of personhood, to sort of not just objectify bodies in a way that is always a part of the erotic and in a way that can be a part of erotic pleasure, but actually to cancel out consciousness from bodies. In that way, I think literature, which I think is our great technology for the communication of consciousness, has a kind of intervention it can play in this moment, in our cultural representations of sex. It's a way of reclaiming the sexual body as a site of consciousness. And the kind of sentence that I'm excited by, which is a sentence with a history, this kind of phenomenological sentence that one could trace. Well, I think the person who invented it is actually St. Augustine in the Confessions, but that one can trace through like Proust and James and Baldwin and Morrison, or people like Hollinghurst and Colm Tóibín. This is a sentence that I think is itself a technology for the production of consciousness. It's a sentence that is constantly falling back on itself to interrogate and correct itself, and yet that is also intensely musical and propelled forward by a kind of rhythmic urgency. And that sort of push and pull and delay and deliverance. I mean, that to me feels mimetic of the erotic and mimetic of sex itself.
As you were speaking, I was thinking about the tension in this, the Gospodar scene that you read, and it's what's different from literature and porn, which is that what you show us is a character engaging in the choice to vacate self, saying, I want to be nothing, I want to be nothing. Whereas what we're given in porn is nothings, who we haven't seen consent to making that decision. And that's a really interesting reversal to show that on the page, show somebody wanting to be nothing, but making that choice, like consciously choosing to be nothing, I think is really, that's what's empowering, and that's what's interesting about it for me.
Yeah, I mean, agency is something that really interests me, and it really interests me, the sort of gradations of agency and, what it means, to what extent one does have agency to give up agency, and what happens, as in the Gospodar chapter, where one realizes that one has made a mistake about what one wants. So the thing to me that delineates, and I don't like to use pornographic as a kind of deprecatory adjective.
I certainly wasn't using it that way.
Yeah, but if I did have to think about a kind of what to me distinguishes, art that is engaged in explicit representations of sex from a kind of deprecatory use of a word like pornographic, it would be that, I think pornography, like propaganda, wants us to feel one thing. It wants to have a kind of unitary effect on us. Art never wants that. I think the art that interests me always wants us to feel multiple and most often contradictory things. So, I love the idea that something I write could turn a reader on. I think that's a powerful aesthetic effect. But, I think it's also going to make people question that response, or feel disturbed by that response, or be interested in that response in a way that, sort of some of the kind of consciousness defacing pornography I'm talking about, I think doesn't intend.
You touched on this just now, and you've said before, you've said, I don't feel I have a responsibility to talk about sex, but you have an urgency that has to do with being a queer artist. And I'm really interested in the expression queer artist, and how that might be distinct for you, say, from being described as a gay artist, whether you made a distinction between those two terms, and what being a queer artist means for you in America right now.
Yeah, so to me, the terms sort of queer artist, gay artist, there is a distinction to be made between them, but they also overlap, and I would claim both of them. And I think there is a kind of specifically gay male aesthetic tradition that's important to me, as well as a broader and more intersectional queer aesthetic tradition that's important to me. One of the reasons that queer was reclaimed in the 70s and 80s by queer activists is because it registers a kind of antagonistic relationship to a dominant culture. And one of the things that seems to me distinctive about being a queer artist in this movement, certainly in a place like America or the UK, where queer people have made extraordinary gains in terms of rights and legal recognition, that much of those gains came at the expense of a queer sexual body. That the marriage equality movement in the United States was very much about packaging queer lives in a way that occluded sexuality, that emphasized domesticity, emphasized, the fact that queer people can be wonderful parents, which is true, emphasized civic responsibility, and really de-emphasized the kinds of sexual practices and sexual communities that have been central to all queer identity and experience. So, in a context in which on one hand, I think America, many parts of America, and probably a sort of majority of Americans, I wonder if even that's true, but is comfortable with the idea of queer people as parents. I think it is still the case that America is disturbed, disgusted, and threatened by the idea of men fucking each other. And, you know, one of the things, and it feels very clear to me that the queer sexual body in America continues to be despised. And so the urgency that I feel about writing the queer sexual body, which is not a responsibility. I don't think artists have responsibilities. I don't think, I would never say that any other artist has a responsibility to make art about anything. But I do feel an urgency about it because I think when you make art about something, you make a claim about its value. And to write the queer sexual body in a way that takes it seriously, that takes queer sexual practices in communities like cruising, like sadomasochistic sex, that takes that seriously as a mode of sociality, as a way that human beings are human with each other, and as a mode of ethical relationship. And then also to write the queer sexual body in a way that I hope foregrounds beauty and makes use of the resources of the English lyric tradition, and you know, to not argue or even to assert the value of the queer sexual body, but simply to recognize it.
To show it, yeah.
To show it, to say, this is here, this has always been there. It's not something you give us, it's not something we argue for. It is a fact that you know, the value of the queer sexual body is infinite, as all human value is infinite. And that the peculiar power that art has to bestow that recognition, to sort of that ennobling quality of art. You know, I hope that writing the queer sexual body in the way that I do is a way of lavishing care upon that body, a way of loving that body.
One of the characters in the novel, G, this is about responsibility and about representation. One of the characters, G, talks about the poems of Frank O'Hara. And he says, I had never read anything before that seemed like it was about me, that I could have written it. And I think, you know, we all have those moments, whoever we are, where we recognize ourselves in fiction. And I think particularly for queer readers, who are used to and trained to, from a very early age, to watch out for danger, to think about coded ways of behavior, to seek kind of interpretation, to find themselves, because they weren't always obvious. You know, there's that sense that I sometimes feel as a queer writer of a responsibility of representation, not the sense I have to do, but in the sense if I am doing, I'm aware that I'm addressing an absence in our culture. And I just wonder, what was your Frank O'Hara moment? What was that moment where you first encountered something of yourself on the page?
Yeah, you know, the most powerful moment of that was, you know, as a kid in Kentucky when I was 14 or 15, just kind of stumbling by chance upon Giovanni's Room, you know, and something like Giovanni's Room, you know, I think about that now. And, you know, I just had a semester, I was teaching at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and I taught a course on queer aesthetics in which we read Giovanni's Room. And, you know, many of my students, my graduate students, were upset by the book and felt, you know, this is such a sort of negative representation of queer people. And I mean, I think that's true. You know, I think really that book is, you know, the logic of that book is largely a homophobic logic. It's a logic in which the possibility of love between men is always foreclosed, always impossible, not just because of historical circumstance, but actually because of a kind of logic of eros that book buys into. And something that's very moving about reading Baldwin's novels, you know, first to last, is sort of one of the things you see him doing is climbing out of the pit of that homophobic logic, so that by just above my head, he is able to imagine love between men in a way that he couldn't in Giovanni's Room. And yet this book, you know, in which homosexuality is always only a closed door, in which nobody ends up happy. You know, I did not, like, there's no way that when I was 14, that book suggested to me that gay people could be happy, or that like, you know, that like there was a sort of...
It's not a joyful text.
It's not, you know, I mean, everyone in that book is destroyed.
Yeah.
And destroyed in large part because of queerness. And yet, that book in which queerness is only ever a closed door, when I was 14 reading it, it opened every door for me. And you know, it's not because of what happens in the plot. I do think, you know, so that book is a tragedy, and you know, tragedy also bestows dignity. So I think there was a way that even though it was a tragic dignity, the fact that queer lives had that queer desire had any dignity at all was life-saving. But then I also think it was style, you know, that Baldwin's style, which the critic Hilton Knowles has described as high faggotry. You know, his sentences, the queerness of his sentences, the queer exuberance of his sentences, that suggested to me a world in which I could live. And that's just always a reminder to me about how complicated the ways in which we use art are, and how important it is that we resist simplistic notions of representation and responsibility. There is not a one-to-one relationship between whether a book is happy or sad and whether it helps me to live my life, you know? And so, you know, I really think that this is something, this question of the responsibility of representation is something that artists, we need to work very hard to protect ourselves from, and to acknowledge that we don't know what we need from art. And that's true both in the art that we consume and also in the art that we make. And that art is made from impulses and urge that precede agency and cannot be accountable to the kinds of responsibility that, say, activism is accountable to.
I don't know if I agree with that entirely, because I think we can use our fiction as activism, and but I'm thinking about your two books and choosing Sofia and the context of Sofia and queerness in Bulgaria. And I know that those books have had a really significant impact on people in that country. And they, you know, they have been for very many people something to hold on to and be inspired by and feel recognized by. And I feel like there's a lived experience of your readers which says we feel seen by you. But I just wondered if you could talk about that and your experience of going there with this text. You know, the narrator who's not named, you know, he's very aware of his privilege as an American, you know, as compared to the privilege of the people around him. And I wonder about, you know, your experience of going there as a queer writer with this book, and what changes the book has caused for people there.
Well, you know, I mean, I would certainly want to be careful about making any claims about any changes the book has made. You know, I think books, you know, are quite limited in the kinds of changes they can have in the real world. I don't quite believe that poetry makes nothing happen, but I think it's probably safer to be on that side of the equation than the idea that books can save the world. You know, so it is certainly true that some of the most moving responses I've had to my work have been from Bulgarian queer people. You know, I certainly did not write the book. You know, I wrote the book very much aware of all the ways in which my book could not be representative, that the book is, you know, it is not a book about Bulgarian queer experience. It is a book about being a queer foreigner in Bulgaria. Yeah. You know, and yet it's also true, you know, at the book launch for the Bulgarian translation, which my very brave publisher in Bulgaria for What Belongs to You, they held that in the National Palace of Culture, just meters from the bathrooms where the book begins. There was a gay male couple in their 60s who came up to speak to me afterwards and who said that under communism, there was no queer life in Bulgaria. It wasn't like East Berlin where there were, underground clubs even. There wasn't. He said the only place you could meet other gay men was in public bathrooms. And, and they said something about, never having imagined that one of those bathrooms might, be the start of a novel, and and feeling in some way affirmed in the complicated way that we're talking about art being affirmative. But look, I mean, in no way is this book simplistically affirmative, either of them.
No, not at all.
No way, and so in that way, I did not write the books with any kind of political program in mind. I wrote the books feeling like I urgently had something necessary, that I needed the peculiar equipment of literature to think about. I don't need that equipment for activism. Activism is crucial to my life. It has been central to my life for as long as art has been. I became an artist and an activist at about the same time. But what's
the relationship between the two for you, Garth? Do you find that one feeds the other, or one draws on the other, or one stops you from doing the other? I mean, I'm really interested in how you manage that tension.
So I think that they are, in my experience, and this is always a personal thing and different writers feel differently. In my experience, they are radically different endeavors because they are radically different in their relationship to the will. It's not that I think that art is apolitical or exists in some kind of hermetically sealed space free from the pressures of history. Absolutely not. And it's not even that I think that, it's that I think activism is a willed activity. I need to have a desired change I want to see in the world, and an intentional plan, a set of actions that I can take in order to effect that change. That is radically different from, in activism, I have to know what I think about something. If I know what I think about something, I don't need art to think about it. I only need this very complex and strange technology of art and of scene making and of the kind of sentence I'm attracted to when I'm confronted by a dilemma. Art is the instrument I have for navigating the abyss. And it's when I feel like I'm staring into an abyss that I wouldn't know how to begin to judge something, that I need this peculiar technology of art. And
so it feels like
distinct for me from activism.
It feels like art for you is more, which is expressed through your technology of writing, is more about questions, and activism is more about answers. If I had to try and create a delineation between the two.
Yeah, art, research into the human, that's what art is. It's a tool for researching the human. And, there may be a relationship between the two, art has been central to my coming into consciousness as a political person. So that's certainly true. But that it's not this kind of willed, intentional, the relationship between them is very mysterious and in my feeling could not be engineered.
We're going to be going to questions in a moment. So I'm just gonna look and see if they are there yet. Whoa, there are lots of questions. So let me just choose a few. So is it important to you that your work is described as queer or gay literature, or would you prefer it was described as simply literature?
I think it is a false dilemma. All literature emerges from particular historical and social conditions. No literature is unmarked by questions of identity, however that's conceived. To me, if a suggestion is ever made that by acknowledging my debt to queer aesthetic traditions and by acknowledging the fact that I am writing books centered on queer lives and that I'm not interested in packaging the values of those lives in a way that makes them immediately legible to a mainstream culture, that in some way gets in the way of universality, I think that's fundamentally mistaken, not just about my books, but also about how art works. Like the magic of art, the alchemy of art, is that it is through devotion to the particular that one arrives at the universal.
Always, it's always true.
It's miraculous. And it's how one can read Horace or Chimamanda Adichie or James Baldwin or Mishima and feel that one is reading both about a world that is very different from the world I know, and also about humanness that is very familiar to me, and that those things can teach me about myself.
Do you think that LGBTQ plus stories are here to stay in terms of where we are? If I think of the fact that there are massive burgeoning YA queer stories. There's it's not just a section in the bookshop anymore. It doesn't feel like it's just a fashion. Do you feel like in a sense the future of stories by and for and about our community is safe, is good? Do you feel like that's?
Well, I mean, I don't feel like anything is safe at the moment. I mean, the last 4 years in both of our countries has sort of shown us, that these gains queer people have made, and not just queer people, are incredibly perilous. And, I think that, the value of queer lives, the value of Black lives, the value of trans lives. This is something that, our lives have to actively give witness to at every moment, that it is not something we can say, this has been achieved. I mean, democracy is not something that is ever achieved. Democracy is an active verb, it's a sort of constant state of becoming. So nothing is safe. Queerness in literature, queerness as an aesthetic tradition seems to me an extraordinarily fecund and exciting conversation. And a tradition is just a conversation between artists across time. And that conversation among queer artists seems to me just extraordinarily exciting. So that definitely seems true.
Would you ever do anything sort of interdisciplinary with other queer artists in terms of fine art, music, outside of your book box?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that, other arts are so important. And in fact, I occasionally teach a seminar on style, in which something we talk about is how would one improve one's style? How does one deepen one's style? And I think, for me, the most powerful experiences that have had that style deepening effect have been across aesthetic boundaries. I've just recently engaged really deeply with the work of a very brilliant young queer photographer named Mark McKnight. I'm currently working.
This is one of his pictures, right? That's one of his.
Exactly right. Yeah, on the UK edition, and now on the paperback US edition. This brilliant photograph by Mark McKnight will be on Cleanness, is on Cleanness. And then, I'm currently working with a very brilliant and largely queer group of collaborators on an operatic adaptation of What Belongs to You. And that—
Oh my God, I had no idea about that.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's the sort of adaptation of What Belongs to You that I'm most excited about. And so, yes, I mean, absolutely.
Stop, tell me everything about this. Tell me everything about this. Who's doing, is there music? Who's doing the music? Who's doing the book? Are you singing? What, tell me.
I'm not singing. So the
You are singing. You are singing. Garth, you're singing.
The person who's singing is a very brilliant queer tenor named Karim Suleiman, who was in my studio at the Eastman School of Music, our teacher, who was also the teacher of people like Renee Fleming. And Karim, 2 years ago, won the Grammy for Best Classical Vocal Performance. And he's going to be singing a piece for chamber orchestra. The ensemble is Alarm Will Sound, which came out of a new music ensemble that I was an early member of and helped to organize at the Eastman School of Music. The ensemble is called Alarm Will Sound, and it's conducted by my former boyfriend, longtime best friend, Alan Pearson, who's been a center of my life for 20 years. And it's going to be great. And, the question of, so it was—
When and where?
So, sorry, what?
When and where?
Well, this has all been thrown into question by Corona. There was supposed to be a workshop performance this summer as a sort of first step to a full production, but that's been scrambled by Corona. And there are conversations with lots of different presenters, but the landscape of arts, I mean, and I think this is much more true in the US even than in the UK, where at least there's been some major government funding for getting arts through this time. There's been none of that in the US. And so we don't know what that landscape's going to look like, but it's going to happen, and I couldn't be more excited.
That's completely thrilling. I'm very excited about that. I can't believe that you managed to keep that from me. How did I not know? This is shocking. I don't think I've ever told you my first boyfriend was an opera singer.
I did not know. Wow.
Yeah, he was. And he took me to my first opera, and it was La Forza del Destino. And of course, and it was in Edinburgh, and I cried, and I nearly broke his hand squeezing it with all the kind of the
Verdi will do that, yeah.
That's a much longer story, and it's not for here. Now let me just see what other questions we have. So another much liked question, and we've kind of touched on this a bit, but I think people are always interested in the idea of process, and we talked about it right at the beginning, this sense of writing pieces and not being aware that you're writing a book until, a certain amount of energy or matter has coalesced around those nuclei. But maybe you can talk about it in the context of what you're working on now on book 3, which, what is that, a trilogy? Are you going to stop after that with this central character? You don't know.
I have no idea. I mean, I don't want to make any predictions about what I'll want to write in 10 years. Maybe I'll want to write, a historical romance. I don't know what I want to write. But it is always the case for me, and in part, maybe this comes from the fact that, I never studied fiction before writing What Belongs to You. What Belongs to You was my first experience of fiction writing. I had never taken a fiction workshop. And so the question of form is not fetishized for me in fiction. There's a way in poetry. So my first education in the arts was music. My second education was poetry. And, and I do have very strong feelings about what is a sonnet, what is a villanelle, and what they accomplish. I just don't have that with this question, which for some of my peers is very charged, of the form of a piece of fiction. To me, when I'm writing, what I think is that I'm writing sentences. And the sentence is really the sort of unit of measure, and also is itself the tool for discovery. It's not that I know what I'm going to write, it's that the sentence leads me where I'm writing. And again, one of the things that is so fascinating to me about art making, and one of the ways in which I think art making resembles desire, is that this weird relationship between will and willlessness. Like, the minute both making art and having sex or pursuing an object of desire are clearly processes that have a lot to do with the will. In some ways, they're sort of hyper-willed activities. They make me aware of my will in a kind of hyperactive way. On the other hand, nobody chooses what they desire, and nobody chooses what they find beautiful. And so both experiences make me at once sort of hyper aware of will, and then hyper aware of my subjection to something that has nothing to do with my will. And the process of writing is really about discovery more than it's about will to me. And the energy of a sentence, the sort of propulsion and thrust of a sentence, and the way that a sentence can turn, that's how I discover what I'm writing. So I don't ever think I'm writing a book until very late in the game.
Would you ever consciously set out to write a memoir?
I certainly never have. And it has always been clear to me with both of my books that even as they may draw on circumstances of life, that those circumstances will be aesthetically charged and transformed in ways that are very fictionalized, and that the books are fiction. There is a way that right now, memoir isn't, I don't feel any impulse to write memoir. I mean, there's a way that fiction and the acknowledgement of artifice and the explicit acknowledgement of form, that's energizing to me. And it's not, I mean, those things can be part of memoir, but
Sure.
I'm very interested in the kinds of thinking that fiction allows.
Okay. Let me see what other questions we have for you. Just bringing them up now. Oh, this is interesting. So it's a very Edinburgh question. It's a very intelligent audience. It's quoting Georges Bataille, who said that language is by definition the expression of civilized man. Violence is silent. Do you think this resonates in your work?
I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, I think, yeah, I don't know that I agree with that. I mean,
you're quite entitled not to agree. You can also, you can argue they're dead, so it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, I love Georges Bataille, but often the claims people make for languageless spaces just don't map onto my experience of consciousness. So, you know, one of the, sometime, maybe this was like a year ago, there was a tweet going around of like, what's the worst advice you've ever gotten? And mine was from Workshop at Iowa, where someone said to me, nobody thinks this much when they're having sex. And I just thought, well, that's not my experience. You know, I mean, my experience sort of sex is radically productive of consciousness. And, you know, some of that may have to do with the kind of sex I had. You know, I mean, maybe glory holes are productive of consciousness in a way that, what's the heterosexual equivalent, like the backseat of a Chevy isn't? I don't know. But it, you know, I don't agree that violence, I mean, there's a complicated argument to be made. I know Elaine Scarry in her book on torture also makes an argument that pain is destructive of language. And that
I'm not sure that that's true.
Yeah, I don't know, but that seems to me more plausible, that there's a way that pain pushes us beyond language. But violence, it seems to me, is often motivated by language, that often violence is narrated as it's certainly by the perpetrators as it's happening. So I don't quite see that distinction.
Okay, well, that I think might be our last audience question. Let me just see if we have time for one more very quick one. No, we don't. They're all far too nuanced and complex. So I am just going to say we're going to have to leave it there, Garth. I'm very sad that we don't have more time. It's gone by very quickly. Thank you to everybody out there for their questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, especially the couple of PhD theses that we had. You can get your hands on a copy of Cleanness in our independent online bookshop, which is shop.edbookfest.co.uk. Thank you all for being here tonight with me, Damian Barr, in conversation with the glorious Garth Greenwell. And thank you to Rob, our BSL interpreter. I'll be hosting more events throughout the festival, and I hope that you can join me again. Enjoy the rest of your fest. Enjoy reading Cleanness. Thank you, and good night.